I'm Lieutenant General retired Charles Hooper, and I'm honored to provide the keynote address for the 2021 Peace and War Virtual Summit here at the John and Mary Patton Peace and War Center at historic Norwich University. I regret that I can't provide my address live and take your questions, but I hope to provide a suitable kickoff for what I know will be a series of spirited and thought-provoking sessions over the next 6 weeks. Going back to the mid 1970s, when I was one of about 30 students out of a class of 1,200 cadets at West Point to study Chinese, I've spent a significant portion of my over 40 years in uniform studying and working on U.S. China relations. While the relationship has endured highs and lows during that time, one theme has remained consistent. The U.S. and China are two nations with fundamentally different views of the world, stemming from radically different histories, cultures, geography, and demographics. While their global interests sometimes parallel, they rarely converge and often diverge. The US is a status quo power, having essentially established the current world order following World War II. China is an ascendant power, a phoenix that rose from the ashes of over 100 years of chaos in the late 19th and through the 20th centuries to become a preeminent world power in the early years of the 21st century. With this in mind, and whether you believe Thudicides' trap or not, it was inevitable that the US China relationship would be characterized by rivalry and competition. The main question is, will that competition morph into conflict? And although we've inaugurated a new President of the United States, the framework for this relationship will almost certainly remain one of strategic competition. Concern about China, in fact, is one of the few points of bipartisan agreement in Washington, and the U.S. public shares this concern. A recent Pew survey found that 73% of all American adults, 73%, view China in a negative light. Now, this is not just a product of Cold War mentality in the United States. The people in the government of the United States are concerned about China's behaviors, such as South China Sea militarization, intellectual property rights abuses, oppression in Xinjiang and Western China, and unfair trade practices. It's also important to note that this is not just a US phenomenon. Unfavorable views of China have been rising around the world. Now, I've heard suggestions in some circles that this is part of some US effort to provoke anti-China sentiment. While that may be an attractive narrative to some Chinese leaders, the evidence just doesn't support it. Key members of President Biden's team, Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, Secretary of Defense Austin, and others, have all expressed their view that the U.S. relationship with China will be their top priority. Perhaps the biggest change we're likely to see is that a Biden administration and the senior leaders in it have made clear that they intend to work with allies and partners to respond to concerns about China. All of them share the same disposition towards quieter, multilateral diplomacy. I expect the Biden team will look to expand on this in areas of trade and economics. Our trade ties with China, as everyone knows, were strained under President Trump, but so were our ties with the EU, Canada, Korea, and others. At the same time, the Biden administration is likely to look to cooperate with China in discrete areas of common interest, such as global public health and climate change. As many of you know, President Biden has already held his first phone call with President Xi Jinping. The 2-hour call was one between old colleagues familiar with each other from their times when President Biden was Vice President Biden and President Xi was Vice Premier Xi. The call was fairly straightforward and basically about both to repeat their existing respective positions, including America's opposition to the Hong Kong crackdown, to Uyghur incarcerations and oppression, to South China Sea aggressiveness, and unfair trade practices. These initial signs indicate that we should not expect much warming in the relationship in the Biden administration's first year. There are simply too many contentious issues in the relationship. And President Biden, quite frankly, is focused on COVID recovery, the economy, and reestablishing trust among U.S. allies. Of course, President Xi won't be sitting on his hands either. China will continue to focus on their own COVID recovery, strengthening trade relations with European and Asian countries, and pushing forward with its efforts to bolster domestic capabilities in key technologies. On that note, there are several emerging issues in China that could have a significant impact on the bilateral relationship in the near and midterm. I will touch upon some of these, and hopefully they will be subjects of discussion during the summit. The first is China's economy. China is likely to experience economic difficulties in the next few years, possibly caused or compounded by its surging debt. Official statistics put China's debt at 275% of GDP in 2020, while external estimates have it as high as 335%. On top of these high levels of government debt, household debt in China is roughly 60% of GDP. Rising debt will be a drag on growth, which could negatively impact the Communist Party's ability to continue to meet the rising expectations of its people. U.S.-China tensions are likely to increase as China's economic and political power continue to grow, and ordinary Americans see the country as a threat to U.S. interest. While the specific disagreements between the two countries may change over time, trade and economic practices will likely remain high on the agenda over the next 10 to 20 years. U.S. policymakers are unlikely to overlook problems of overcapacity and unfair trade practices in the interest of promoting economic openness. The next issue is climate and environmental issues. Like every country, China is vulnerable to climate change and particularly vulnerable to the negative environmental impact of its rapid industrialization and modernization. China's political and economic system may allow it to undertake the kinds of costly, large-scale mitigation efforts that will be needed to deal with the worst effects of climate and environmental change. However, the success or failure of these efforts could have a significant impact on the Chinese economy and the confidence of the Chinese people in the regime's ability to address their needs. The third issue is one of demographics. By 2050, China's over 65 population will be growing, while the overall population, having peaked at 1.44 billion around 2029, will begin to shrink. In other words, China is growing older faster than it is growing richer. Chinese leaders are aware of this trend, which could lead the government to try to secure strategic and economic dominance before the resource requirements of its aging population force a change in budget priorities. Already, the strains of the guns or butter debate are showing. People's Liberation Army veterans have repeatedly protested outside of Zhongnam High in Beijing in recent years, demanding better pensions and health care. Social security concerns remain a top 3 issue in an annual poll of Chinese citizens for the past 5 years. The next issue is China's internal politics. President Xi Jinping is 67 years old, putting him at age 96 in 2049, the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Since China amended its constitution in 2018 to abolish presidential term limits, Xi has further concentrated power and is expected to remain in office for life with no indication of a potential successor. As a result, the transition of power between President Xi and his ultimate successor will be disruptive. If President Xi dies suddenly in office with no succession plan in place, the jockeying among rival CCP factions could lead to a breakdown in governance, scapegoating of foreigners and foreign companies, and provocative behavior abroad. And finally, the U.S.-China security relationship. Not surprisingly, in their confirmation testimonies on the Hill, Secretary of Defense Austin and Deputy Secretary of Defense Hicks both confirmed that China will be the pacing country and the U.S.-China competition the pacing issue for a Department of Defense modernization. This is well and good, since almost 20 continuous years of increasing defense budgets and investments in China in cutting edge technologies have provided Beijing with a formidable array of military capabilities. And make no mistake, Beijing's singular military modernization goal remains the ability to provide the People's Liberation Army a decisive edge in any conceivable armed conflict with the United States, especially over Taiwan. The result of all this is an increasingly lethal Chinese military. The PLA Navy has more than 350 ships, 4 ballistic missile submarines, 8 nuclear attack submarines, and a number of other capabilities, including its first domestically built indigenous aircraft carrier. Its rocket force has over 1,250 intermediate range ballistic missiles, and they have invested significantly in missile technology specifically focused on attacking and destroying American aircraft carriers, as well as their very well-known investments and research into hypersonic weapons. They have invested heavily in counter space capabilities, as well as offensive and defensive cyber warfare capabilities. And finally, the PLA Air Force and the PLA Navy aviation forces are moving quickly to replace their legacy aviation platforms with 4th and 5th generation platforms, including the imminent fielding of the J-20, China's first indigenous 5th generation fighter aircraft. Now, I assess that friction points will remain in those places where we've seen them, in the Taiwan Straits, the South China Sea, and the East China Sea. And in fact, we've already seen the Biden administration react vigorously and aggressively to Chinese incursions into the Taiwan Air Defense Identification Zone with aircraft carrier exercises off the South China Sea, as well as freedom of navigation operations in the Taiwan Strait. That said, while there's always the possibility for an unanticipated incident between our militaries in those areas where we operate in close proximity, for now, the probability of a full-scale armed conflict with China over Taiwan or on the Korean Peninsula remains low, for now. Some of the engagement mechanisms to conduct crisis management atrophied somewhat under the Trump administration, but there is evidence that the Biden administration will place emphasis on key leader engagements, military engagements, and some of the existing crisis de-escalation mechanisms, such as the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, and that they will ensure that the lines of communication remain open between our national command authority and that of the Chinese government. Finally, as many of you know, on the 10th of February, President Biden announced the establishment of a Department of Defense China Task Force. The DoD Task Force will conduct a comprehensive review of national security policy and programs related to China. It will be led by Ely Radner, the Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for China Affairs, and include a mix of civilians and uniformed military personnel from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Staff, the Uniformed Services, the combatant commands, and the intelligence community. The mission of the task force is to identify challenges and opportunities for the Secretary of Defense and try to serve as the team's prioritizer or triager to determine what are those priority events that require the Secretary's attention and what are those that can be delegated to other elements and offices in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and in the Department of Defense. The task force will likely assess the way the military is postured and positioned in the Asia-Pacific region, accounting for the number of forces, location, and equipment, and the employment of our military capabilities in the Indo-Pacific region. Its review is expected to evaluate, for example, the need for surface and air patrols in the South China Sea and in other areas in the Indo-Pacific region. There are two key points about the task force that the summit should address. The first is the task force is charged with not only identifying challenges, but opportunities as well. And so one of the questions that we should discuss at the summit is, What are those opportunities and how do we exploit them? The second point that I think is worthy of discussion during the summit is the task force is meant to infuse military views with political, economic, and diplomatic elements of our policy to come up with a whole of government or administrative wide policy. And I would say this is very important since one of the first things I learned is that our military, diplomatic, and economic relations with China are all linked. And events that occur in one area, for example, in the security domain, often have a corresponding impact in the economic domain and in the diplomatic domain, and vice versa. So the question for consideration during the summit is, how do we formulate this policy, this whole of government policy, when our desire to do business with China sometimes clashes with our security interest? So the underlying message coming from both Washington and Beijing confirms the theme of this summit, which is the framework for the U.S.-China relationship will be one of rivalry and competition. But I should point out here that competition is not conflict. In his latest article in Foreign Affairs, former Australian Prime Minister Rudd discusses the concept of managed strategic competition, which he defines as both countries establishing certain hard limits on each country's security policies and conduct that would allow for full and open competition in the diplomatic, economic, and ideological realms, but would fall short of out-and-out conflict. Now, this makes perfect sense to me, but as with all policies, the devil is in the details and in the actual execution. In conclusion, at the most basic level, the United States and China must figure out how to coexist. Both are nuclear powers and both will be superpowers both in the security realm and the economic realm for the foreseeable future. So both sides need to be able to communicate even when they disagree and to understand the difference between things that they can do, things that they should do, and things that they have a right to do. Hopefully, we will explore these questions and more during the Peace and War Summit. Again, I'm so pleased and proud to give this opening keynote address, and I wish us all a productive, safe, and healthy summit. Thank you very much.